The war that created modern air power. How World War I turned fragile airplanes into deadly weapons. When World War I erupted in 1914, military leaders were preparing to fight a war that looked remarkably similar to the wars of the 19th century. They expected cavalry charges, mass infantry assaults, and artillery duels stretching across Europe. What they did not expect was that one of the most important revolutions of the entire conflict would take place thousands of feet above the battlefield. At the start of the war, airplanes were little more than fragile machines made from wood, wire, and fabric. Many military commanders viewed them as interesting experiments rather than serious weapons. In fact, the Wright brothers had completed their first successful flight only 11 years earlier. No one imagined that these primitive aircraft would soon transform warfare forever. Yet, within 4 years, airplanes would evolve from flying observers into deadly fighters, bombers, and strategic assets. World War I did not merely use aircraft, it created modern air power. And the story of how that happened reveals one of the most dramatic technological transformations in military history. The first role assigned to airplanes was surprisingly simple: observation. For centuries, armies had struggled with the same problem. How do you see beyond the horizon? How do you discover where the enemy is moving? Before aircraft, armies relied heavily on scouts, cavalry patrols, and observation balloons. But these methods had serious limitations. Then came the airplane. For the first time, military commanders could look deep behind enemy lines. Pilots flew reconnaissance missions over trenches, railroads, supply depots, and troop concentrations. Suddenly, generals had access to information that had never before been available with such speed. This seemingly small innovation changed everything. One of the earliest signs of aviation's importance came during the First Battle of the Marne in 1914. Reconnaissance pilots observed weaknesses in German troop movements and reported critical intelligence back to Allied commanders. That information helped the Allies launch a counterattack that stopped Germany's advance toward Paris. It was a warning. The nation that controlled the skies could influence the outcome of battles on the ground. As the war settled into brutal trench warfare, reconnaissance became even more important. Millions of soldiers were locked in defensive positions, stretching across hundreds of miles. Aircraft became the eyes of the battlefield. They photographed enemy positions, tracked troop movements, and directed artillery fire with increasing precision. Soon, both sides realized a dangerous truth. If reconnaissance aircraft were so valuable, they had to be protected. And if enemy reconnaissance aircraft were gathering intelligence, they had to be stopped. This necessity gave birth to a completely new form of warfare: air combat. At first, pilots carried pistols, rifles, and even bricks to throw at enemy aircraft. The skies resembled a strange experiment rather than a battlefield. Pilots would wave at one another before attempting crude attacks, but the situation escalated quickly. Machine guns began appearing on aircraft, and suddenly the struggle for air superiority had begun. Yet a major problem remained. Most aircraft had a propeller mounted directly in front of the pilot. Any machine gun firing forward risked destroying the aircraft's own propeller. It was a dangerous engineering puzzle. The French attempted an early solution by installing metal deflector plates on propeller blades. The concept worked, but it was far from perfect. Then came a breakthrough that would temporarily change the balance of power. In 1915, Dutch aircraft designer Anthony Fokker introduced the synchronization gear. This revolutionary system allowed a machine gun to fire through the spinning propeller without hitting it. The technology synchronized the weapon's firing mechanism with the movement of the propeller blades. It was simple, brilliant, and deadly. The German Fokker Eindecker became the first aircraft to effectively use this innovation in combat. For a brief period, German pilots gained a major advantage over their opponents. The Allies suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Reconnaissance missions became far more dangerous. German pilots could now hunt enemy aircraft with unprecedented efficiency. This period became known as the Fokker Scourge. The psychological impact was enormous. Air superiority was no longer a theoretical concept. It had become a strategic necessity. But technological races rarely last long in wartime. The Allies responded with new fighter designs of their own. Aircraft became faster, more maneuverable, more heavily armed. What had started as observation platforms were rapidly evolving into specialized combat machines. And with this transformation emerged a new type of military celebrity, the fighter ace. These pilots became some of the most famous figures of the war. Newspapers celebrated their victories. Governments turned them into national heroes. The public became fascinated by their exploits. Among them, one name would become legendary: Manfred von Richthofen, better known as the Red Baron. Flying his distinctive red aircraft, Richthofen achieved 80 confirmed aerial victories, making him the highest-scoring ace of World War I. To many observers, these pilots appeared to represent a romantic form of warfare. Knights of the sky, engaging in personal duels far above the mud and horror of the trenches. But the reality was far less glamorous. Aircraft remained fragile. Mechanical failures were common. Pilots faced freezing temperatures, unreliable engines, and the constant threat of being shot down. The sky was becoming every bit as deadly as the battlefield below. Meanwhile, military aviation continued expanding beyond reconnaissance and fighter operations. Another mission was emerging: bombing. Early bombing raids were primitive. Pilots sometimes carried small bombs and dropped them by hand. But military planners immediately recognized the potential. Aircraft could bypass front lines and strike targets far behind enemy defenses. Factories, railroads, supply centers, cities. A new dimension of warfare had opened. Strategic bombing was born. The technology remained limited during World War I, yet the idea would shape military thinking for the rest of the 20th century. Future conflicts would demonstrate just how powerful this concept could become. World War I also accelerated aircraft development at an astonishing pace. When the war began, aviation technology was still in its infancy. Aircraft were slow, fragile, and unreliable. By 1918, the situation looked completely different. Engine power had increased dramatically. Aircraft designs became more sophisticated. Specialized fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance planes entered service. Military aviation had transformed from an experimental curiosity into a critical component of modern warfare. The speed of this evolution is difficult to comprehend. Imagine comparing a smartphone from 20 years ago to a modern device. Now, compress that transformation into just 4 years. That was the pace of innovation during World War I, and the consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. The war created entire aviation industries. It drove investment, engineering breakthroughs, pilot training programs, and military doctrines that would influence future generations. By the time the conflict ended in 1918, political leaders around the world had learned a crucial lesson. Aircraft were no longer optional. They were essential. No major military power could ignore them. The warning signs were impossible to miss. Control of the skies increasingly meant influence over events on the ground. This realization would shape military planning throughout the 20th century. The massive air campaigns of World War II, the strategic bombing doctrines of the Cold War, the creation of independent air forces. All of these developments can trace their origins back to the skies over Europe during World War I. What began as a reconnaissance tool evolved into one of the most powerful instruments of modern warfare. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of this story. World War I was not simply a conflict fought with airplanes. It was the conflict that transformed aviation itself. A war that turned fragile flying machines into weapons, turned adventurous pilots into military icons, and turned the sky into a battlefield. The airplane entered World War I as an experiment. It emerged as a revolution whose consequences still shape the modern world today.